You don't see that political choreography in China anymore, but 1960s-style cultural revolution choreography is alive and well in nostalgic Manila. 40 years ago, the first quarter storm rocked Manila, which had not seen anarchy on this scale since the Pacific War. Student radicals were inspired by Mao's smashing of the four olds: old customs, old culture, old habits, old ideas. What was new then is old today, and Red Revolution in the 1970s has to contend with peaceful, nonviolent revolution 1980s style. Tonight, a look back at the first quarter storm. I'm Manolo Quezon, the explainer. Let me start with a quote from Mark Kurlansky writing in his marvelous book, 1968, The Year That Rocked the World. The thrilling thing about the year, Kurlansky wrote, was that it was a time when significant segments of population all over the globe refused to be silent about the many things that were wrong with the world, and this gave the world a sense of hope that it has rarely had, a sense that where there is wrong, there are always people who will expose it and try to change it. From Cuba to China to Czechoslovakia, France, Mexico, Poland, and the United States, young people began to rebel against the establishment. Kurlansky believes the post-war generation was prepared to do so, ironically because of the relative security and comfort they enjoyed and their having been born after the privations and traumas of World War II. And so, young people in communist countries challenged party dictatorship, while their counterparts in the democratic world turned leftward to challenge the bourgeois certainties of their elders. For it was in that year too, here in the Philippines, that an elite family celebrated a wedding anniversary with heedless ostentation. Now, Filipinos born after the war who had no memory of that period or the succeeding era of the hooks came to share the restlessness and iconoclasm of their counterparts around the world. So in 1968, as I mentioned earlier, when the Lopez family celebrated their wedding anniversary, people got mad. Now in other places like the Philippines, students also demonstrated against things like the Vietnam War. It was the year of the Tet Offensive after all, and for social reforms in the Catholic Church and in the schools. In that year, Senator Benigno S. Aquino Jr. published a commentary in the American publication Foreign Affairs, describing the country as, let me quote, "a land consecrated to democracy but run by an entrenched plutocracy. Here too are a people whose ambitions run high but whose fulfillment is low and mainly restricted to the self-perpetuating elite. Here is a land of privilege and rank, a republic dedicated to equality but mired in an archaic system of caste." Now, Aquino was writing in response to the massacre of the Lapiang Malaya ralliers on May 21, 1967. Democracy, as I mentioned, had survived the Hook Rebellion, and yet even then, the beneficiaries of the relative stability of the mid-50s to the mid-60s left an increasingly better educated and cosmopolitan urban middle class in discontent. The first quarter storm came 2 years after the rest of the world was convulsed by student rebellions in 1968. By all accounts, 1969 was the year in which protesting in the style of the civil rights movement in the United States, that is, peaceful, nonviolent, reformist, gave way to more militant protests and bluntly revolutionary aspirations among the youth, along with the flag hoisted with the red field up. Ferdinand Marcos won an unprecedented full second term as president towards the end of that year. Now, in those days, when presidential terms began on Rizal Day, December 30th, a newly elected president delivered his annual State of the Nation address at the opening of Congress in January. In 1970, that address to Congress was scheduled on a Monday, January 26th. A mere 4 weeks had passed since Marcos's inaugural as the Republic's first fully re-elected president. Now, recalling the era for the Philippine Century, an anthology of writings published in the Free Press, veteran journalist Dan Mariano writes, and let me quote, "Outside the legislative building, hundreds of moderate student activists were demonstrating to urge the government to call a constitutional convention." Now, Jose Pete Lacaba, in the January 26th confrontation, a highly personal account, the first of his articles on the first quarter storm for the magazine, writes that student leader Edgar Hopson, who was then a moderate, had his group's microphone kept away from radical student leader Gary Olivar, and the radicals wrangled with the moderates just as Marcos had finished his speech and was stepping out of the legislative building. It was then, Mariano's account continues, that a papier-mâché crocodile representing government corruption and a makeshift coffin symbolizing the death of democracy flew in the direction of the Marcoses and his wife Imelda. Security aides quickly hustled Marcos into his waiting limousine and sped away from the angry mob. Moments later, Manila police, armed with truncheons and rattan shields, attacked the student demonstrators who fought back with empty soft drink bottles, rocks, and the wooden frames of their placards. Now, the moderates tried to pacify by means of speeches the radicals, and among them, the radicals, including the Kabataan Makabayan, didn't pay attention. The radicals, as Lacaba reports, were, quote, spoiling for trouble, end quote, with the cops and were, quote, in no mood for dinner party chatter and elocution contests, end quote. From the battleground that was the vicinity of the legislative building on P. Burgos, the demonstrations that now launched the first quarter storm moved to the premises of Malacañang. Now, after a relative lull of 3 days in which student groups still took to the streets to denounce the government, then came Friday, January 30th. So far, the most violent night in the city's post-war history, as Lacaba writes in retrospect about these events. Now, the radicals were demonstrating again in front of the legislative building that day as the moderates went to Malacañang for an audience with Marcos that turned into a tense confrontation. By the end of that meeting, the radicals had trooped as well to the palace. Now, as Lacaba reports in "And the January 30th Insurrection," let me read, "What specific event precipitated the battle that spread out to other parts of the city and lasted till dawn the next day may never be known. The students who came from Congress claimed that, as they were approaching J.P. Laurel Street, they heard something that sounded like firecrackers going off. When they got to Malacañang, the crowd was getting to be unruly. It was growing dark and the lamps on the Malacañang gates had not been turned on. There was a shout of, 'Sindihan ng ilaw, sindihan ng ilaw.'